Good afternoon, Malaysia, and everybody. It's morning for me here in the UK, and I'm joining this webinar from my London apartment while we're under strict Tier 4 lockdown as a result of COVID. I think we're dealing well with over 16.5 million vaccine shots already given to the most vulnerable groups. I hope the situation in Malaysia continues to improve with the lockdown or the ongoing MCO that's going on. So I wish that we all receive the vaccine and the situation get better. I would really like to thank Dr. Jaspal and the team for inviting me to write the module on university support for commercialization, and also to join this webinar to talk about some of my experiences along my journey over the last 17 years in working for university tech transfer officers, leading initiatives, including a government initiative in Malaysia over 6 years, and also my experience back in Australia. I'd also like to thank Uni10, the Royal Academy of Engineers and LIF for supporting this program, which I think will bring much value to Malaysia as well as to the rest of the world, as these webinars as well as the modules are available or will be available online. It's really a pleasure to be connected to Malaysia again through this webinar, and I'd really thank Dr. Jaspal again for inviting me for this. So in terms of today's topic, university support for commercialization, what I wish to talk about mainly is how universities support, or how they have been supporting effective knowledge exchange, technology transfer, and commercialization. And what I'm rather going to talk about is on the latest trends on what universities are doing to support commercialization, mainly from an international perspective, by bringing examples that I think will be very valuable to you. So you will see that when you receive the module, in my webinar, I haven't really stuck to the content in the module, because you will have access to that later on with all the information that I put in. But I would be rather talking about some case studies and bring some real facts and examples from elsewhere in the world to demonstrate to you why and how universities support commercialization. So I think when we have a look at the usual technology transfer scenario across universities in Malaysia, as well as across other countries in the world, I believe that there is still a lot to learn as to why universities should support commercialization of their research and development outputs. And different universities have different motivations for doing this. And everybody talks about the money, the revenue. Yes, it is important. It has been important, and it will be important, especially in the post-COVID era, COVID and post-COVID era, which I will also touch base. Yes, money is important. It is a definite incentive, and we can't discard the fact that that is an incentive for supporting commercialization. But there are other factors as well that drive this whole landscape. Is it about knowledge or technology transfer, or is it about really translating the university's research into commercial outcomes? Is that another driver? Is that a main driver? Or is it societal benefits and impacts that have been created or that can be created by transferring university R&D into the commercial domain? Or is it for building reputation and receiving recognition? Is it for creating impact, in other words? Is that what universities would like to do as a means of supporting commercialization? Or is it to demonstrate entrepreneurship and create a culture of entrepreneurship amongst the researchers within their own universities? Or is it to give back to society, help the society as well as the economy of the nation create more jobs, and so on. So what is it really? What are universities doing now, as opposed to talking about 10 years ago, 20 years ago? What are the latest trends is what I'm going to talk about, so that you will get an idea from an international perspective what universities are doing. And I'm sure some of these align with what's happening with Malaysian universities as well, in my experience, in my recent experience in Malaysia. So in order to take you through this journey, I'm going to be talking about a few case studies to bring some insights to you on what universities have been doing and what have been their major drivers in supporting commercialization. And I believe that this information would be quite valuable to you if you're in the university management, to take some of these learnings, take back to university and think how you can adapt or adopt some of these practices or best practices to make your commercialization efforts better, more fruitful, more efficient, and more user-friendly, I would say, especially for industry partners and for the researchers within your respective universities. So the first case study I've chosen to discuss this is coming from Stanford University with their 2010 annual report, when they published this document called 40 Years of Discovery. Now, if you have listened to some of my speeches back in Malaysia, this is an example that I often bring, but I'm going to elaborate much more on this because there's a lot of learning points here. Stanford Office of Technology Licensing published this back in 2010, as I just mentioned, and they demonstrated their performance, their drivers, and what they did over 40 years from 1970 to 2010 in supporting technology transfer, licensing, and commercialization. So one of the things that you need to bear in mind is it is called the Office of Technology Licensing and not technology transfer. And that is because they are primarily involved in licensing technologies and not so much on startup creation or spin-out creation. And the reason being, when it comes to the American or the US researchers, they tend to be quite entrepreneurial. So they love to go down the path of creating their own startups by licensing the technologies into their startup from the university. And therefore, Stanford has been primarily involved in licensing technologies. Now, I would like to bring to your attention this particular slide. And this is a letter, basically, that was issued back in 1970, October 9th, with supplementary comments to the licensing program. Now, when they started the licensing program, they started as a kind of a pilot, it was supposed to go into the annual report to the president of the university for their 1969-70 annual report. And I would like to highlight a few things that they mentioned in this letter, because this was 50 years ago that they wrote this letter. But when we look at tech transfer, when we look at licensing and practices, as well as support towards commercialization, it is very, very surprising what they wrote in this letter is applicable to this very day. Okay, so basically you can see here in the first paragraph of the letter, they are talking about the program office was established on a formal basis in January, 1st of January 1970, and is composed of a manager and an administrator or secretary. So you can see they started with just one commercialization manager and one administrator to support him, support Niels. And in the second paragraph, you can see, in a very real sense, the office is directly coping with the university's current financial difficulties in its invention licensing activity. So this is what we often hear, right? Even today, the universities say, oh, funding, tight funding, restricted funding, we have little funding towards commercialization and so on. This existed for Stanford even 50 years ago, right? So it is normal. That is something we have to deal with, something we have to work through and still make it work. Now, although the program has only been operating on a full-time basis for 9 months, income to the general fund and departments from the already negotiated minimum royalties during 1970-71 will more than exceed project expenses of the office, including salaries. Now, how did that happen? Because they did some good deals with industry partners, which I'll talk about later. But of course, it exceeded because it covered the salaries of 2 people, because they just had to manage 2 people and some patent costs maybe, and that was it. So they already could show that they could incrementally develop the staff as they as the scale of the volume or scale or the volume of the operations developed further. And they also say future license income. This paragraph is really, really important, and I really like it. Future license income projections are difficult as they are affected by, here is number 1, quality of inventions offered. Now, I can't stress enough about this very fact. Quality of inventions arising from quality research is second to none when it comes to technology transfer, right? So make sure that your research is of quality, your inventions are of quality, it is industry relevant, it is market driven, and you will have a deal at the end of the journey through a license or a startup. And the program is only optional. Optional means that if researchers wish to commercialize, they could. If they didn't want, they would leave them alone and not put pressure on them to commercialize. Third one, the quality and initiative of our licensees, general business conditions. And that is also a factor, how industry basically linkage themselves with universities and the quality of these companies, whether they have enough money, whether they have the expertise to take your innovation or your IP and fully develop them through to commercialization. General business conditions, as you know, the general business economy is another factor. And I love this, luck. And you do need a bit of luck to get things going in tech transfer, as with most other things. As a case in point, current business conditions, in particular, the tight money market, have a great impact on our licensing success. Don't we find the same today? It is. Nevertheless, with a crystal ball firmly in hand, a net income to the general fund departments of several $100,000 per year is cautiously predicted after 1974-75. Now, if some of you have been tech transfer directors in universities, I'm sure the University Council or the management would have asked you for a forecast of how much revenue you will generate. And here, Stanford themselves said back in 1970, if we do have a crystal ball, and assuming we have a crystal ball to predict the future, we predict that there will be good revenues. And that is very much the case, because tech transfer is really, really difficult to predict. And what is even more difficult to predict are the revenues. But once you have done many license deals, and if your licensing portfolio is large, you can make some fair assumptions on what the revenues will be based on future royalties and sales volumes that the companies predict. But apart from that, it is a very, very difficult task. So there's a lot of learning points here from Stanford from 50 years ago, from this very letter that we can learn today and that we can employ in our own practices. So in 1972, 2 people managed the operation of the Office of Technology Licensing and were happy to conclude their first year with $55,000 in revenue from 3 option license agreements. So they say some of their most important inventions were actually disclosed in the 1970s, and you will see when these inventions that were disclosed in the 1970s actually brought them money. It took a decade or sometimes even 2 decades for them to go through to industry and create significant royalties back to the university, which we are going to look at shortly. Now, if we have a look at here, this shows their royalty distribution over the 4 decades. So in the 1970s, 80s, 90s, and 2000s, and how they distributed these revenues or the royalties received towards the inventors or the inventor researchers, the department, and the schools. And the figures are in in thousands of dollars. So in the first year, they distributed $500,000 to the inventors, 700,000 to the department, and approximately 700,000 to the school. Now you can see they nearly doubled that in the second year. The second decade. And 10 million, 11 million, and 11 million, and so on. They grew and they grew and they grew and they scaled it up. So what we can see from these figures is that Stanford as a university started the whole operation quite sensibly. They just put 2 people to start it with. They just wanted these people to put their heart and soul to make it work and generate some revenues. And then they increased the number of staff, which I will get to shortly. And then they saw further increasing revenue. They may have done a lot of awareness raising within the university. They may have refined their policies to make sure that more and more inventors came on board. They would have put in so many incentive mechanisms to get academics to engage more in the commercialization process. They would have developed or further developed the entrepreneurial culture within the university in order to achieve these results over 40 years. However, what is most important here is what I have extracted from this report over here. 40 years after they started operations on tech transfer, they say from their birth, their mission continues to be to transfer Stanford technology for public use and benefit, which means that translation of R&D outputs into societal benefits and creating impact has been their mission and their guiding mantra, which is to do what's best to get the technology out to the world. So, which would mean that they would also go into extensive negotiations to make sure that they somehow transferred a commercially viable technology into industry wherever possible, and that is what exactly they have been doing. And revenue seems to be secondary in their mission. But you can see, just because they just wanted to transfer as many technologies as possible with quality research, quality inventions, their revenue naturally grew. And if you have a look at their numbers within the 40 years, what you can see here are the royalty income that they generated every 10 years. And this is in thousands of dollars. So that's 2.7 million, 58 million, 393 million, and 877 million, generating a cumulative total of 1.3 billion in revenues. During this time, they had 8,300 invention disclosures. In 2010, they had 2,700 active inventions with 3,000 licenses signed. So you can see that they're getting more than a third of their invention disclosures licensed, which is a real indication of the quality of research and the quality of inventions and the industry relevance of their research. They had 850 active licenses operating in 2010, generating that royalty income over the 40 years. And you can see the top 3 inventions generated 870 million. This came to about 863 million when I looked at the numbers and calculated it for myself. It's thereabouts, but you can see out of the 1.3 billion, only 3 inventions brought 870 million. Now, isn't that an eye-opener? Let's talk about that in a minute. Royalties to Stanford inventors that were distributed was 1.2 billion out of 1.3 billion. Now, what does that say? The university has been very generous in distributing the royalty income to the inventors rather than absorbing it back to the university. So, and then of course they had a 45 million research incentive fund to support some of these efforts, commercialization efforts. Now, what you can see here is their growth. They started very small, and every 10 years, you can see that they improved their operations, they improved their scale, and step by step, they went on to scaling it up to making it a big success. Now, this is only the numbers in terms of the royalties. Just imagine what those technologies would have done out there in the society. These would have been, medical technologies, technologies relating to software, algorithms, and so on, which you will see shortly. So they say, again, coming from this report, just as 40 years of innovation have led to some of the technologies we depend on today, innovation will be the key to the next 40 years and beyond. Some of the inventions we see today will be the basis of the technologies we will rely on in 2050, while others will not make it beyond the laboratory. Now, that is a reality, isn't it? Although we know no one can always pick the winners, which is very true, as we look ahead, we see some clear trends and exciting possibilities. Now, Stanford is so right to say this and mention it in their 40-year report. And some clear trends and exciting possibilities are what we are going to be looking at in terms of university commercialization, university support towards commercialization in this webinar. Given the current, the very negative environment around COVID, around what's coming over the next few years, there are still possibilities that universities can actually reap benefits from and help support the economies and countries to come out of this and be a part of it. Now, again, looking at how Stanford supported the commercialization and expanded their operations, I actually had a look at the numbers in this report or in this case study. So you can see in the 1970s, for a good 10 years after starting their tech transfer operations, they basically had 2 to 3 people in their tech transfer office. Okay, so these 2 to 3 people generated that $2.7 million during that decade. And then you can see how they have slowly but steadily increased the number of staff within their tech transfer office from 3 to 17 in the second decade, and 17 to 22 in the third decade, and 22 to 33 in the fourth decade. And this is a clear example of a university strategizing very well and organizing themselves to increase and resource the tech transfer office with increasing scale and volume and the number of deals that they do. So if we have a look at the top 3 revenue producing inventions each year, you can see that if we have a look at the top innovation that brought the highest amount of money in the first decade, they earned 2.7 million in royalties, but the biggest innovation brought $600,000. So you can see that out of the 2.7 million, 600,000 was from just one innovation, and another 200,000 and another 200,000 from 2 others, and so on for the rest of the decades. So what does this say? This says that a great majority of innovations will not bring big money, but a very rare few are the ones that bring the big money. And this is something that universities need to realize in their support towards commercialization. They can't expect every 1 in 5 invention disclosures to be a big hit or a blockbuster, as they say, or a unicorn. It is very, very rare. And I will move on to the next slide to demonstrate this even more. Actually, yeah, on the same slide, this reality window. So revenue from the top 3 innovations came from Google text searching, which actually originated from some graduates, 2 graduates in Stanford. That has brought them the highest amount of money, 337 million in royalties. The second one was functional antibodies, 271. DNA cloning was the third one. The total was 863 million. Now, I mentioned previously that the total royalties earned was 1.3 billion over the 40 years. And I checked in the report that the total number of inventions that brought this 1.3 billion was 2,421. So if we remove these 3 innovations, we have 2,418 inventions that brought 437 million, which accounts for 34% of their 1.3 billion, averaging 180K per deal, which is pretty good. However, you can see only 0.1% or 3 inventions over 40 years brought 66% or 863 million of all royalty income. Now, isn't this an eye-opener? And these are real facts coming from a reputable institution to say that you don't get big hits that often. And in fact, when I checked Stanford annual reports, they say less than 5% of their deals bring over 100K or $100,000 in royalties. So it is about translating a lot of research for societal benefit and impact, and that's what these figures tell us. 99.9% or 2,418 inventions brought majority of their, brought 34% of their royalty income and not the majority of their income. So that's something very, very important to bear in mind as universities when we are looking at the revenue generated through innovations. So what does this say? This is the reality. Many big successes are brought by a very few good deals. But does it matter? Does it really matter? The answer is it depends. It depends on what the university is expecting out of their research translation. And again, I would like to point why Stanford is doing this. 40 years, their mission is to transfer the Stanford technology for public use and benefit. And their guiding mantra is to do what's best to get the technology out to the world. Now, as I mentioned, most financially successful invention for Stanford over the 40 years, one invention disclosure out of the 8,000 they received during this time was Google. And that came from two Stanford graduate students. And can you believe that? Given all that research going on, researchers like, professors and everybody involved, their most financially successful invention came from two graduate students. Now, what does this say? Don't only focus on researchers. Don't only focus on postdocs. Focus on students as well, because their innovations can be quite valuable. It could be quite applicable out there in industry. So as a part of university support for commercialization, please include students and make ways and means by which that you can invite these inventions to come through and to be a part of your tech transfer function. So how do you measure true impact? And this is coming from the Association for University Technology Managers. Now, the reason why I brought this impact is because this is what Stanford has been really focusing on. Now, Ipn talks about this, and they say, and yet, in attempting to assess the impact of tech transfer and determine future investment in its practice, can we really put a number on the benefits to society? So that 1.3 billion royalties, can we use that as a number to put benefits that the society may have reaped through the DNA cloning technologies, the monoclonal antibody technologies, and so on? By demonstrating significant growth over time through metrics ranging from licensing income to new products, can statistical results quantify actual improvements in the human condition, how it has helped the humankind, the mankind, the society? Can numbers reflect the creative research achievements of individual institutions while highlighting the need for continued support of intellectual protections and efforts to advance tech transfer globally? So they are asking some really, really critical and valuable questions here. And here is their answer. Their answer is, when coupled with the compelling human stories behind them, metrics start to sum up the human impact of technology transfer. And this is very, very important for universities to understand. And if you have a look at the current and the latest trends from most of the universities across the world, they are putting revenue, the revenue becomes secondary or even tertiary. Impact becomes more important, and that is because the university as well as the inventors gain much more recognition that drives up their ranking, drives up their reputation as an institution and individual. So that is what we can learn from the Stanford story. And to look at another trend that some universities are following, especially in being more generous towards researchers, I bring out my second case study to share with you, and this is coming from Imperial College London. Imperial College London is the second most innovative university in Europe and ranked one of the top 10 in the world year on year. So let's have a look what they have done in the very recent times to support commercialization, to incentivize researchers through their new initiative called Founders' Choice, where they piloted this program, I think around in 2017 over an 18-month period. I think the pilot was very successful, and then they moved on to deploying this. And I would like to share the learnings from this with you. So the Founders' Choice from Imperial College London is a program that they set up to help founders or researchers start up their own businesses, own ventures at Imperial College London. So it provides the staff with different levels of support, and they started with an 18-month pilot in order to see what is the take-up rate by the researchers, and they really want, and in the second paragraph I want to highlight that Imperial is saying it reflects the fact that entrepreneurial ecosystem at Imperial has grown and evolved over the past 2 decades. Now it has grown, it has evolved, so what are they doing now in order to scale it up and in order to support more, which is a current trend, current practice that they're establishing, which is why I thought it would be very, very interesting to share this with you. So under this, basically, in cases, so they have two different groups who will take up this Founders' Choice. And basically, they have two approaches. One is the founders themselves agree to take up the venture forward, in which case the equity distribution will be different. And if Imperial College is a part of this, which means it's a joint venture between Imperial and the researchers in starting up the company, in going through that journey, then the equity share is very different. So their policy has changed. Their policy doesn't say if a university researcher is creating a startup company or a spin-out company, the Imperial College must own 50% of the starting equity. They have changed this because they want to improve their entrepreneurial culture. So now they're providing a choice to the researcher to say, what do you want to do? Do you need our help at a very high level? With a very high level of support, our starting equity is 50-50. If you need very little support, we will help you to license the technology into your startup, and you run with it, and we will provide some support. So that's the difference. So that's why it's called Founders' Choice. Now, if we have a look at what they're doing through this, when there is the decision to commercialize technology through forming a startup company, their division, enterprise division, which handles their technology transfer, licensing, industry partnership, commercialization, and all, they have a clear founder's guide to educate the researchers, and they also have an equity modeling tool for them to make an informed decision on whether the researchers want to jointly drive with enhanced level of support received from Imperial in making the startup success. Or they have the option to go through the founder-driven model with very basic level of support or very little support from Imperial, where the researcher or inventor themselves, himself, herself, or if it's a group themselves, would take the startup and run with it. So under the jointly driven route, when there is a lot of support received from Imperial, which is what most universities do now, you can see the Imperial College basically receives 50% of the equity, and the inventors receive 50% of the equity. This is the starting equity. But however, once the management has been identified, if there's a new CEO coming in from elsewhere, they will give them some equity, which is basically eaten half from Inventors and half from the college. However, if it is founder-driven, then Imperial gives the inventors 90% of the equity, or even 95%. And Imperial takes 5 to 10% of equity. And they will provide some support in licensing and introducing them to investors and so on. So you can see when there are options or the equity shared between the management, when the CEO or the CTO comes into the startup, then it again comes through the inventor's share, whereas Imperial retains their 10% as undilutable or non-dilutable equity until there's an investment cap of 3 to 15 million pounds. So that's how this model works. Now, I think this is a very, very bold move. It's a very good move because I can see researchers being very open to this kind of offering and saying, I'm a new researcher, I don't know how to do this. I want to start up a company, but I want your help. So your first venture, you can probably jointly drive with Imperial support so that you learn in the process how to do it. And then once you've done it, you want to become more entrepreneurial and a serial inventor, serial startup researcher, and then you want to move into your second one. And then you might think, hey, actually, I don't want to give 50% back to Imperial again. Now I know how to do this. So this time I'll go through the founder-driven route. I will only give them 5 or 10%. Isn't that great incentive for the researchers? So this is a very, very recent trend that Imperial is following. And I'm sure there are some other universities who have done this in the past and who are also doing this right now. Now, here is what they get when it's jointly driven and when it's founder driven. Basically, lawyers start up the company and there's an IP standstill letter. If it's jointly driven, it's not required because Imperial is heavily involved. But if it is founder driven, the university will say, okay, we will hold the IP for you for a fixed period of time. You need to put the startup together, get it up and running. But if you don't do it by a certain date, then of course, we will need to decide on the fate of that particular piece of IP, whether we are going to license it or whether we will discuss with you, whether we will jointly run it with you. And you can see with the jointly driven choice, they have an enhanced support level. And with the founder-driven model, they have very basic support level. So basically, Imperial will support under the enhanced support level. They will help to establish the business, register the business. They will help to write the business plan, recruit management, hire advisors, and provide warm introductions to inventors. So if you're a new researcher coming into this domain, it's fantastic to go down this route because you will learn everything along the process. And once you're done with that and you move on to your second, third, fourth, then you can go to the founder-driven startup model because you've learned everything through this process. So they will help you with finding investors and they will help you to pitch and so on. Whereas here with the founder-driven model, they will show you how to do it. They will introduce you to investors and that's it. So the level of support is different when it comes to post-formation support and so on. And also the university equity is different, as I mentioned, 50% with the jointly driven startup, which is dilutable, and 5 to 10% non-dilutable for an investment cap between 3 million to 15 million pounds. So IP is licensed to startup on arm's length royalty-bearing terms in both cases. Now, I found this to be a really, really, really good model. But of course, there are inherent challenges and problems as well that Imperial needs to address and fine-tune as they move forward. So this is a very recent process that they have established and one of the latest trends in the tech transfer landscape. So what did happen after Imperial did this? They received a lot of praise for doing this. And Global University Venturing published this news article to say that, hey, look at this, Imperial College is doing, and they're prepared to give up to 95% of the equity in their startups to their inventors. That means the university has been very, very generous. And then, of course, another article written by Tom Hockday, the ex-Oxford University innovation CEO or managing director, where the article was titled "A university should be as generous as it can afford to be," right? And he basically mentions here that the choice for founder academic researchers at Imperial appears to be about 50% and a lot of help, or 95% and some help. This is an example of a university choosing to be more generous because it believes more good things will happen as a result, more impact, never mind about the money. It is a very good idea, and Imperial is to be congratulated. So Imperial was praised for taking this bold move to make sure that there is research translation, there is new venture formation, and so on. With Imperial having 5% of founder shares, it moves alongside the global superstars, Stanford University and MIT, often praised by investors and lobby-prone government for wanting only 5% of their startup's equity. Fantastic move and a latest trend. So again, I think that is something that should be highlighted and is praiseworthy in terms of another well-reputable organization and university is looking at how they are looking at supporting commercialization. Now, the third case study is from Oxford University Innovation. And again, this is another trend that I have recently observed and I would like to share with you. And that is basically looking at how they have changed their approach and attention in creating spinouts. What you see here is what I have, the data I have gathered in the table from their annual reports. From 2000 to 2014, Oxford University Innovation, they spun out about 4 to 5 spinouts per annum. And this continued until 2015. You can see that they created 5 spinouts. Look at the jump in 2016. Obviously, they made some big decisions here. They decided to go all out on spinouts. And the reason why I think this happened is because they realized that there was a lot of quality IPs stuck that were venture worthy, and therefore these deserved spinouts as the route to commercialization. So you can see here from 2015 onwards, they have had nearly a 4-fold increase in magnitude in the number of spinouts they created each year following 2016. Okay, and then I had a look at how many spinouts Oxford had created ever since they first started creating any spinout. And I found that was in 1959. Okay, I think that was with Oxford Instruments. And then I had a look at how many spinouts they had created to date up until last year, 204. Now you can see, if we were to add these up, from 2016 to 2020, they had created 99 spinouts out of those 204. Now, isn't this a recent trend for Oxford? They have clearly taken the initiative to significantly scale up their spinout formation operations since 2016. And this also shows that nearly 50% of all spinouts formed between 1959 and 2020 have been formed during the past 4 years. So what does this say? This says that the university may have realized that, yes, licensing all well and good, but at the same, it's the easier route, the less risky route, but creating some star spinouts can create much impact to Oxford, to impact to the society, and really demonstrate the entrepreneurialism within the university. So I think this is a very noteworthy observation that I wanted to share with you as a part of university support for spinouts in the journey of commercialization. Now, the next case study I'm going to share with you is a recent study conducted, I think it's about 5 years ago, but the findings are valuable, and I think these findings would go for another 10, 20 decades. if I'm correct in my assessment. So this is a recent study conducted in the US that was basically titled, "Is it all about the money? How are US academic licensing officers tasked and motivated?" So this was a joint research project conducted by Harvard, Boston, and Brandeis universities, reputable organizations. So you can rely on the data. They have done a very comprehensive research. They had about 165 institutions joining this research, and out of that, I think they had about 120 universities across the US. So what are the key findings from this? When they called it, "Is it all about the money? How are US academic licensing officers tasked and motivated?" And this is a real demonstration of university support towards commercialization and why they're supporting and why they are continuing to support. They found that over 50% are making losses through their technology transfer functions. So only less than 50% of commercialization programs bring in more money than the costs of operating the program. So you can see more than half of them make a loss. And look at this figure. Only 16% are self-sustaining, bringing in enough income that after distributions to inventors for research, enough remains to cover the operating costs of the program. Now, when you receive the royalty income as the tech transfer office, what you do is you distribute it to the researchers, to the departments, and to the central admin of the university, right? Administration. Now, once all that has been deducted, there is enough money left to support the tech transfer function. Only 16% are self-sustaining in that sense, right? The most important drivers of technology transfer are, now this is very important when we take these learnings to our respective institutions to look at. Number one, university service. The tech transfer function is meant to provide a service to the university and the researchers for them to actually translate their research. Translating the results of research with revenue maximization a distant third. Many institutions do not have formal mission statements, but those that do establish a broad non-financial objectives for their offices. Now, isn't this something important for us to realize as one of the latest trends across universities elsewhere? So, and understanding that number one, motivation is to provide it as a service. Number two is to provide it as for translating the results of research. And number three is their income. The third priority is the income. Only a small number of academic institutions have reaped very large rewards from their technology transfer activities. And that is very true from looking at the Stanford figures. Fewer than 10% of US institutions' technology transfer programs are primarily motivated by financial return. So very, very important to bear in mind when we design, strategize, and operationalize our own TT functions. Now, this paper also explains that less than 10% of public universities make money out of their commercialization activities. So net profit, self-sustaining public universities, you can see here that it's less than 10%. And they also found that there is a direct correlation between the size of an institution's research expenditure and its commercialization profitability. So higher the research expenditure, the higher the commercialization profitability. So if we were to look at the 5 RUs in Malaysia, if they have the highest research expenditure, we should expect the highest number of invention disclosures, licenses being signed, spin-outs, and highest profitability if we were to look at the same landscape, but there are differences, of course. And what drives their behavior? So this research looked at, this case study looked at what drives their behavior. And they found that faculty service was the top ranked at private universities than at public universities. Research result translation is chosen by a greater number of public universities than private universities. Revenue maximization was listed as the third driver, and the number one driver at 14% of public universities versus only 7% of private universities. Okay, and here are the results that they have published. And if we were to have a closer look at what is driving the behavior of university support towards commercialization, public universities say it's mainly faculty service. We want to provide this support towards commercialization to provide it for the faculties, for researchers to go and translate their technologies. Private universities, faculty service, public research institutes, research results translation, private research institutes, faculty service. I can't see revenue here at all. Revenue is the third priority, as you can see here. So here are the numbers of the respondents and what they said. So only 11.5 said that revenue was their top priority. And if you have a look at how the TTO is funded, where the funding came from, in terms of whether it's from 100% from the institution or the 100% from licensing operations, there's a very clear correlation between the size of the university's research budget and how its TTO is financed. So higher the research budget, the more money that they will invest in the tech transfer function. So there should be a fine balance. And this was very, very, very clear from the Stanford example. When they started with 2 people, and then over time, they grew as their research budget increased, their scale of operations expanded. At very small universities, over 60% of TTOs are entirely funded by the institution, while none are funded entirely out of the licensing income. So you see, if you're a small university, it is highly unlikely. And if the university management is expecting to bring you all that money, please show them some of these figures. These are research data across the universities from somewhere else where there is a lot of good practice, best practice, and who have tried this over a long period of time. So when we have a look at the profitability versus research budget, basically what it says here is that if you have a large research expenditure, the chances are it is highly likely that you are profitable. But if you are a very small university, it is more likely that you're going to be loss-making through your tech transfer function. So they say over here at very small universities, 76% are loss-making and none are self-sustaining. So if you're a small university and your management is expecting you to be profitable, you can show that 76% are usually loss-making and none are self-sustaining. And the other 24%, probably they've had a 1 big deal or 2 big deal or big hit, as we call it, and that's how they're making their royalties and money until the royalties run out, and they probably would fall into the loss-making category following that. So this paper also says that this relationship between size and profitability is almost linear. As the research budget of the institution increases, the profitability of the TTO increases. So those are the case studies that I decided to run through today to share some of the latest trends, to give you something new, as opposed to talking about how universities should support commercialization, which you might already know. You have been to a lot of seminars, webinars, workshops, and so on. But I wanted to bring some real-world examples, some latest trends to basically share with you. You may not have known about some of the things I talked about in terms of what's happening right now. Now, I'll run through some of the material that I have covered in the module. These are covered quite comprehensively in the module, so I'm not going to run through in detail. I think I got about another 10 to 15 minutes to finish. So I will run through in point form or with very brief descriptions. Now, why commercialize outputs of R&D? And let's have a look at it from a 3-lens view. Benefits to the university, benefits to businesses, benefits to society. Because when we look at from this broader perspective, I think revenue maximization becomes a secondary or a tertiary priority. So if we were to have a look at benefits to the university, is that, and by the way, I have basically put these points together looking at what's happening across universities, most universities across the globe who are doing this very, very well, and who's voicing out what the benefits to the universities are, what's the benefits to their businesses and to the society are. So these are some of the things that you need to take into consideration in working out your own TT functions and working out your priorities. It builds reputation, it creates impact, both societal and economic, as we have seen through the case studies that we just discussed. Of course, it generates revenue. which is good, which is certainly an incentive. I'm not de-emphasizing that. And establishing a culture of entrepreneurship has become a priority for most universities and a benefit that they reap through supporting commercialization. Building industry partnerships and linkages, co-development and collaboration opportunities, as well as translation opportunities. Co-development and collaboration opportunities are with industry partners, so you get linkage to industry, and then that will give rise to translational funding opportunities, both from industry funding support as well as government translational funding support. If you have a look at benefits to businesses, it solves industry problems, and it is very cost effective for them to go to a university and license an existing technology, because that way they would have access to a very large pool of external expertise, equipment, as well as infrastructure. And then, of course, as with universities, they have the opportunities for co-developing their intellectual property rights or the university's intellectual property rights. And they certainly can leverage on translational funding opportunities available from the governments and other supporting bodies. What are the benefits to the society? Real-world application of university R&D to solve problems, create societal and technological benefits. And that is very, very clear if we have a look at some of those numbers coming from AUTM in terms of creating jobs, contribution to the national economy that uplifts innovation, which is what exactly I'm going to talk now, looking at some of the data from AUTM. So if we have a look at this data that's available from AUTM website under their licensing survey from 1996 to 2017, it has created a contribution of 1.7 trillion USD to US gross industrial output, 865 billion contribution to the US gross domestic product GDP, and nearly 6 billion jobs created. Isn't that fantastic? Nearly 500,000 inventions disclosed by universities and research institutions, 108,000 US patents issued, granted, and 14,000 startups formed. And just imagine the number of jobs it would have created. And here you go, another figure, 67% of university licenses are to startups and small companies. Now, this is a reality that we should always embrace. Majority of your licenses will go into startups and small companies. Only a smaller proportion will go into large companies, medium or large size companies. And here is the data. And 200 plus drugs and vaccines developed through public-private partnerships since the implementation of the Bayh-Dole Act. And this is a clear indication of how university support towards commercialization, tech transfer commercialization can help drive an innovation economy, which Malaysia is aspired to achieve as a high-income nation, or achieving high-income nation status. And then in terms of benefiting society and the economy, AUTM represent these numbers in terms of invention, evaluation, IP protection, marketing, licensing, product development, and so on. So they're looking at the entire cycle involved in commercializing university technology, which again is a representation of the societal benefit and economical benefit that universities tend to follow more nowadays when they're looking at tech transfer and commercialization. So what kind of support mechanisms can be deployed by universities? And I basically categorize this into three different areas in the module that I have written. The first one is basically the policy framework. I will quickly go through each of these to highlight. I'm sure most of you are aware of this, so I'm not going to go into detail because you can read the module once you receive it. Ipn Commercialization Policy forms one of the backbones in universities' commercialization, support towards commercialization efforts. It talks about IP ownership, which is mostly owned by the university itself, and the researchers are the inventors. And it talks about treatment and protection of IP, who is responsible within the university for the treatment and protection of IP, and what are the revenue distribution percentages to the inventor, to the department, and any other parts of the university, and how spin-out equity will be distributed. Like I mentioned in case of Imperial, they have changed it. It's not 50-50 anymore. The founders have a choice. And then also equity ownership and how it is managed. So these are the things that a clear IP and commercialization policy should establish, so that the researchers and inventors are clear about how things are progressed when they want to translate their research into real world or commercial outcomes. And the second policy that becomes very important is an academic consulting policy, which basically outlines the rules for providing academic consulting to industry, government, and other entities. Now, a lot of universities have so many different arrangements, but universities should realize this is an important avenue through which knowledge is basically transferred to external entities from universities. And it has also been proven to be extremely useful in solving industry problems by new technology development and in underpinning industrial innovation. And another advantage of academic consulting is when you consult and provide consulting services to an industry partner, it gives the industry partner a test drive with the academic and the research group to see how well they will work together. And this might spur additional collaboration and funding opportunities for the research lab, for the research group, as well as the inventor, that can grow into partnerships, joint ventures, and so on. So academic consulting should not be discounted and should be highly encouraged by universities. And that is another trend that I have noted within a lot of universities. They are providing this as a service to academic to promote consultancy, and they have very clear policies around this. Conflict of interest policy is again another policy that the US is basically asking their universities to strictly adhere to and manage properly to further enable commercialization. And the conflict of interest policy deals with things like, okay, if you're the inventor, you're running a startup and it involves in your own IP and you're creating new IP and you're saying that it's created at the startup, within the startup company and not at the university. How do you distinguish? Because you are biased, you're an equity shareholder in the company and so on. So through a policy, these kind of situations need to be managed without putting a big barrier between the inventor and what they want to do with their innovation, and identify that conflict and manage that conflict so that it ends up being a success and not a barrier, and basically something that will stop the whole operation moving forward and commercialization not happening over time. So that is what's covered under the policy framework. These are very important policies when it comes to supporting commercialization within universities. In terms of providing a good framework, there are a few things that the universities need to do. They have to choose their directors very, very carefully and get these directors to run tech transfer offices over a long period of time. Now, one of the things that's happening in Malaysia, in my experience, is that the university would choose to bring in an academic, get them to run it for a few years, and there is nothing wrong with that. I think these academics are very smart, intelligent people. They quickly learn, they quickly pick things up. But the problem is their tenure is 2 years or 3 years, and they're pulled back to their departments. And then the momentum stops. A new director comes in, a new director has to learn from A to Z everything, because they're new to tech transfer, or they may have done something, but tech transfer is much beyond licensing, much beyond creating a startup. There's a lot of other things that you need to learn as a director to manage it effectively. So I think that is something that universities need to get right. You need directors who can be there over a long period of time, gain that momentum, maintain that momentum, and really scale things up over time. Technology transfer project managers need to be really skilled. They need to know about engaging with academics, having a decent conversation with them, technically savvy. They need to know about IP protection, marketing, negotiation, license execution, and so on. So these individuals are very difficult to find. But in Malaysia, now we have quite a few RTTPs, so that's good news. Really, really happy to see that people getting accredited at RTTPs, and that really shows that it is growing in Malaysia as a recognized profession, and which is also internationally recognized. And then the other resources are legal, finance, marketing, and administration, which is provided through the university or through the tech transfer office itself. Funding, universities can provide funding through the formation of an IP protection fund to support filing patents, Then they need a proof of concept fund or prototyping fund to further support to move technologies that are at very, very early stages to a technology readiness level where it is attractive to industry partners. Seed funds to support some startups would be good, and of course translational funds that's either identified and sourced through the university or from elsewhere, such as the government. And there are other mechanisms that include that a lot of universities do nowadays, and these include incubators and accelerators, enterprising activities such as demonstration days, industry days, and so on. The approval processes that they establish would be very few layers. And this is when you have a license to sign in. It doesn't have to go through 5 different layers before it comes back to you, and takes 6 months before you can execute a license agreement. So they would limit this to 2 or 3 layers at max. 2 layers would be nice. 1 layer would be best if it's possible. And then of course managing conflicts of interest effectively, so that there is no barrier to academic entrepreneurship. Now, all this I have explained very clearly and in much more detail in the module, so I'm not going to go through in details. Now, in terms of strategies, I think this is where universities can be more creative. How to incentivize the researchers. As I spoke to you just now, emphasize some of those benefits that other universities across the world are focusing on. What are the real benefits? It's not only the money, but there are a lot of other things that they can think of. And receiving top-down support from the university to encourage and incentivize researchers can be done. And universities can get very creative about this and deploy mechanisms in order to do it. And recognition, when universities or researchers take something to commercialization and it becomes a real success, that would spur more innovation, give them incentivization and encouragement to do more. Creating impact is highly focused by many universities across the world, because that would enable them to attract more research funding from the governments when they demonstrate what impact they're creating out there in the society and to the economy through their research translation activities. In terms of industry engagement, universities can be very creative again with having specific mechanisms to linkage with industry, basically uplifting their academic consulting activities, using intermediaries such as InPart, which are mentioned in the module, external intermediaries to look at universities, whatever is the marketable technologies. They look at it, they take it to industry as well, so that this way you can expand your marketing initiatives, and also to have demonstration days, industry days, run challenges, theme-based challenges in collaboration with industry partners, and so on. In terms of creating a technology transfer platform, this is your technology transfer office. I think that platform should be able to engage with academics effectively and receive or generate invention disclosures from them, protect commercially viable ideas, market and promote them, negotiate deals and execute them, and manage these deals post-deal. So in all this, stakeholder management becomes very, very critical. You have to manage the academics, you have to manage the industry partner, you have to manage the university. It's not an easy job, it's a hard sell. But having created a technology transfer function that can address all this more effectively will bring better results. That is what we have seen. So in terms of the governance structures, there are 3 models in terms of best practices that I will describe here. The first one is basically the university has the TTO as a unit within the department. And the advantages of this is that academics perceive that as a part of the university, so they are more comfortable to deal with it. It carries the same university branding when they're dealing with industry. Employee benefits and HR policy for the TTO staff is similar to the universities. It's less costly to establish and operate. What are the disadvantages? It relies on university resources most often in terms of finance, legal, marketing, and so on. And it may have to go through layers and layers of approval to get anything done. So the bureaucracy becomes a part of the issue. Risks of potential litigation, university takes the hit straight away. And the industry partner perception is that, oh, the TTO is a part of the university, could be a pain to deal with because they would be slow, because the university is going to slow their pace of operation. Second model is the wholly owned subsidiary model, where there's a separate company that's formed as a separate legal entity wholly owned by the university. And the advantages of this is that there may be dedicated resources in terms of administration, legal, and marketing within this, with delegated authority to execute documents. And it is also a de-risking mechanism, because if there's commercial litigation, it's not straight to the university, this entity takes the hit. And industry partner perception is that, okay, they're a Sindhurian Berhad, they're a company acting on behalf of the university, and we are a business, so it may be easier to deal with them, and they have their dedicated resources, so hopefully they can move fast. Staff remuneration and rewards can be basically customized under a separate legal entity as opposed to going with the universities. However, it is a very costly operation, because separate legal entity, you have to employ people separately. The academic perception would be, oops, it's not a part of the university, so we are not comfortable dealing with it. So there may be trust issues. The branding may be different if it doesn't carry the university's branding, and then employee benefits and HR policy might be different too. So it's not bound by the universities. And then there is also this hybrid model where the TTO still remains as a part of the university, but they will form a TTO Sindhurian Berhad as a shell entity. And that is mainly done to manage risks. So there are no people, it's a virtual platform to execute license agreements, as well as to manage equity, whereas the TTO and the actual people, physical office is retained within the university. So these are the three models and their pros and cons, and why universities support commercialization through various different models. It's just that universities make up their own mind. I've got this slide and another slide to go, and then it's done. But I couldn't stop this webinar without talking a bit about COVID and how universities could move ahead and carry themselves along in terms of commercialization during COVID and post-COVID era. I think it all comes down to strategy. Now, last year I was I was running a university wholly owned subsidiary model company back in Australia, and when COVID hit, what we did was we strategized and we strategized and strategized. So basically, what we had a look at was all the licensees were pulling out. Some contract researchers who dealt with industry were complaining that the industry is pulling out, they're stopping all the research and so on. So how did we strategize? We had a look at, okay, who is still interested in working with us? And then we went back to them and we had a look at what research was still highly relevant in the new world. And the new world was, we are going through a pandemic, and how are industry partners, how are investors looking at this? What is their perspective? And then looking at how to map it out and how to identify opportunities where we still could support commercialization. It may not be as good as without the pandemic, but you still can strategize, you still can move along through this period and in the post-COVID era. And then you can align yourself where possible. If you have research expertise in an area where companies say, hey, we are developing a new diagnostic or a vaccine or something, and this is a good lesson to all of us. We need to develop technologies to combat situations like this in the future. Align yourself and pay attention to multidisciplinary research. So because of COVID, it's not only biotech companies who are involved in this, software companies, data companies, big data companies, a whole lot of companies are involved. And therefore, your research would still be very, very, very valuable because software, sensors, materials, it all becomes relevant when it comes to multidisciplinary research and putting innovations together. So engaging with academics as well as industry has moved to the click of a button. Everything's done through the click of a button. So don't think that because of COVID, you can't engage with industry. You still can. And there are universities who are doing this very effectively, which I have seen in very recent times. And then Don't be afraid to go out and ask businesses, go out in the sense via Zoom if you're under lockdown, or Teams, to see how they're doing. Try and approach them and see how they have refocused their innovation efforts and strategies. Map it out so you can get a good idea about what is commercializable out of your existing portfolio and what you can do as researchers to help support some of these problems to be solved out there in industry. So, looking at the common trends, universities leading in technology transfer tend to focus more on impact while also focusing on faculty service, translation, and revenue being a distant third, as I mentioned before. Academic engagement has become very, very important for most of these institutions, and they are changing their policies to incentivize academics to come ahead, come forward, and join in this commercialization effort. And that involves awareness raising, education, capacity building, policy changes, as I described before, all seems to be a priority. And there is more focus in creating new enterprises, as I mentioned, Oxford, Imperial, and of course Stanford as well. You know, in new venture formation in terms of startups and spin-outs. And it is also notable that most universities continue to run TT functions at a loss, and a very few are self-sustaining, and that's a reality that we need to understand and bite the bullet on. This needs to be understood by the universities and change their mindset if it hasn't changed. If we have to make it run it at a loss, we run it at a loss. Why do we run it at a loss? Well, then our priorities are this and this and this. Because if your priority is revenue and you are running it at a loss, you're not going to receive any support. You don't want to provide any support because you're looking at two different things, right? Bringing in revenue and not running it at a loss. It doesn't gel. But if your priority is to create impact, to see your researchers becoming more entrepreneurial, providing it as a faculty service, see more of your research being translated, then it would work. And running it at a loss doesn't become a big issue if you gain more recognition for what you're doing. Some universities are becoming more generous towards academic inventors to incentivize them to commercialize. This is very clear across the leading universities and the general trends they are following. Universities seem to make up their own minds about how they wish to strategize and operationalize their TT functions. Now, this is my last message, the final message. It is up to each and every individual university to make up their mind on how and why they want to support commercialization. And that way they come up with their own model and what works best for them, but it is as good as who they employ to look at this side of commercialization within their own respective organizations, and who is going to run them, and how strategic they are, and how supportive the university top management is towards commercialization. And that can make all the difference, because that can change policies, that can change the resources that is required, the funding that is required, the human resources, and the rest of it. So that's my last message. Thank you very much for joining this webinar.